Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about this subject. The legal frameworks and the national authority that is required for deceased organ donation. This is a schema of the processes needed for organ donation and transplantation. For a simple program involving living organ donation and living procedures only, living donor needs donor assessment and a medical risk in relation to transfer of diseases to the recipient. Recipient obviously needs assessment as a suitable recipient. There needs to be a cross-match to determine the immunological suitability of the match, followed by surgical retrieval from the living donor and transplantation into the recipient, post-operative care, and then long-term transplant follow-up with a registry to record that data for transparency and for reporting to the Global Observatory on Donation and Transplantation, as well as for public health management within a country. When you add deceased donation, you add a couple of things to this. Firstly, with respect to the deceased donor, there is the legislation that surrounds and the medical issues that surround the diagnosis of death, and that will be the subject of our conversation today. The same assessment of donor medical risk needs to happen and recipient cross-match, but instead of the leisurely pace of living donor assessment, which can occur through laboratories in other countries, for example, with deceased organ donation, it has to happen within a few hours. Surgical retrieval is technically slightly different, but in terms of the kidney, it becomes the same. Organ allocation is another critical element that is different from the living donor, where in ethical programs, the living donor is specific to a particular recipient. But in deceased organ donation, systems must be in place to make a decision about organ allocation. And in fact, those countries that don't have very transparent and open organ allocation systems have very low rates of organ donation. The community doesn't trust where the donation will end up unless they understand how the decision will be made, particularly in countries where donors are the poor, head injuries, motor vehicle accidents, uncontrolled hypertension, and the recipients are rich, wealthy, able to afford transplants. Organ allocation, major national issue. The rest is the same. Deceased organ donation, of course, includes the issue of tissue banking and tissue utilization. So in determining the national regulation and legislation, a country has to make a number of decisions. Firstly, compatibility with the World Health Organization guiding principles. 156 countries or so endorsed the 2010 guiding principles and therefore abide by those guiding principles. We'll cover them. Decisions need to be considered about the inclusion of all medical products of human origin. The basis of consent by a deceased person is critical, and the definitions of death become an important national context. So I leave you to stare at this picture for just a moment or two until you can see both the devil and the angel. The devil in white and the devil in black and the angel in white. Inextricably linked into one whole. And that is the field of organ transplantation. The devil rides with the angel. And it is the purpose of national legislation, regulation, and enforcement to retain the boundaries, to prevent the devil, and to utilize the angel for the support of the community. You have help with this. The Declaration of Istanbul, fostered by the Transplantation Society and International Society of Nephrology, is a foundation document for professionals to understand their professional obligations in the process of organ donation and transplantation, endorsed by more than 120 countries, organizations, including countries, but a critical element of ethical organ donation. And as I mentioned before, the World Health Organization has guiding principles, originally in 1991 and now endorsed in 2010 with a revision. And that is to guide nations in the critical issues and to provide member states with standards and with assistance if requested. So the WHO guiding principles from May 2010 include 11 specific areas of consideration: consent, death determination, deceased and living donors, protection of minors and incompetent persons, the banning of sale or purchase, the promotion of donation and separating it from advertising or brokering for specific individuals, ensuring responsibility for the origin of a transplant, understanding the justifiable professional fees involved, considering allocation rules, and then the newly added guidelines on quality, safety, and efficacy, transparency, and confidentiality. And they are an important set of guidelines which every nation needs to look to. And as you see in this diagrammatic representation of those guiding principles, they cover the process from donation through to the transplant recipient. There are many products that come from the human body. The principle is that the human body and its parts are not the source of financial gain. They're each different in their own view. The reproductive technologies are different to the hematopoietic stem cell bone marrow transplant technologies, are different to blood transfusion, plasma use, intravenous immunoglobulin, organ donation, corneal donation, and then the more modern human-derived drugs. A nation has to understand how to regulate and legislate each of those environments, and one law doesn't fit all of them. Organ donation and unmodified tissue donation are separated out by most nations. Many will also include hematopoietic stem cell, but will separately legislate on gametes and embryos, blood and plasma. So a decision needs to be made on the extent of inclusion of all medical products of human origin. A gift. What is a gift? When you donate an organ, it is voluntarily and legally binding, uncompensated transfer from one individual to another. You can't demand it back. And the gift law principles have important legal consequences for organ donation. It becomes a legally binding transfer. There is prohibition on valuable consideration. It's not a gift if you're given valuable consideration in return. And it defines altruism and volunteerism in many people's minds. There are two primary legal models around the world: explicit consent, called opt-in, and presumed consent, called opt-out. Must you have in life consented to donation after death? Or are you presumed to be a donor unless you have specifically opted out of being a donor during life? The fundamental difference between these two. And many countries have opt-in and many countries have opt-out laws. And there are some differences which are defined here. But actually the implementation of those laws in the intensive care unit comes down to a very similar set of processes. Even in the opt-out process, where if you have not opted out, you are a donor. If the family object, there is very seldom a procedure to recovery of organs. Whereas in the opt-in system, the authority must be explicit, either by the patient or by the family, and in the Australian law, the family not objecting and not finding that the individual objected in life to organ donation. Which works better? It's a matter of political and national consideration. And then we come to death. The function of the brain is irreplaceable. If you have lost your brain, you can be a body, but you can't be a person. The soul has left with the function of the brain in some iterations, but there is universal agreement that without the brain function, you have died. Now, that was an issue which had to be addressed initially as organ donation became a technical issue in the 1960s, and this came from the ad hoc committee of the Harvard Medical School, which defined brain death, 1968. The subsequent law, uniform state laws in the 1980s in the United States, formulated the Uniform Determination of Death Act in the US. And many other nations have taken their guidance from that. So an individual may be dead if they have sustained irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions. The movie star public perception of death, holding the mirror up to the nose and mouth to see if there is breathing, feeling the pulse to see if there is circulation, and then declaring to the movie audience that the person is dead. Irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions. Or, much more complex for the community to understand, irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brainstem. How is that seen? How is it perceived? And of course, with community attitudes, how is it understood? Two separate definitions of death. Operationally, the loss of capacity for consciousness, lack of current, future potential for awareness, wakefulness, interaction, capacity for sensory perception, or responsiveness to the external environment. And brainstem function includes many nerve pathways, but includes the inability to breathe spontaneously. And it must be permanent. It will not recover. It is loss of function that will not resume spontaneously and will not be restored through intervention. Will not or cannot, slightly different. Now, this person is dead. Their brain, that great big white space in the middle of the skull, is not receiving any blood supply. You can see the blood supply in the scalp, around the skull, but not in the brain. And if blood supply to the brain is halted for more than about 3 or 4 minutes, the brain is dead. One, if you like, operational definition of brain death. In framing laws about death, it's actually much more complex than we mostly consider, because the national legislation around a variety of other areas impacts. For example, what do your ownership and gift laws say? What happens with respect to therapeutic goods laws and regulations? How do you define a nationality? Critically important as you come to living donation. What about customs and excise laws for cross-border transfer of organs, cells, tissues? Most bone marrow from unrelated donors crosses borders. Needs to be considered. And how do private healthcare laws, private hospital laws, government hospital laws impact, and their regulations impact? Do countries specifically permit transplantation and donation? Or can anybody do it legally? And finally, the consent framework, which we've discussed a little earlier, about whether your country is ready for an opt-in program or an opt-out program. Technical capacity, intensive IT capacity, national awareness systems, the framework of religion. All of those play into the mechanism of consent frameworks. So the laws and regulations in the middle that define human organ, cell, and tissue donation and transplantation must be framed in the context of all these other laws, and there are probably other examples depending upon each individual country. When it comes to the final analysis about how a law operates, it comes down to who does the community trust? Because without trust in the community for deceased organ donation and its allocation, there will be little or no deceased organ donation and transplantation. If the community don't trust the system, then they won't donate. And that is proven time and time again across many countries. One European example where the organ donation rate collapsed overnight in relation to a scandal about the allocation of organs is very well known, Germany. Without trust, in that case, without trust of the doctors allocating organs, the community decided not to donate. Turned off like that. So who do you trust? The ministers of health and justice? Not in every country. Society leaders, religious leaders. The Ministry of Health? Not in many countries, I'm afraid. Hospital administrators? Do you trust hospital administrators? Can they be bribed? Are they independent managers of the system? Completely different perspectives of the world. Do you trust a committee, more than one person sitting around in a room making a decision? Or is it doctors that you need to trust? You can lose faith in doctors independently of the other mechanisms. But if doctors are regulated, the community may not lose trust. Or do you need committees of doctors? Do you need a number of doctors to make the definition, make the diagnosis of brain death? Or must it be a committee of doctors who make that diagnosis? Must they be independent? Most laws would say yes. You cannot have a self-interested individual make a diagnosis of brain death and then go to the operating theatre, do the transplant, and bill the recipient. There must be independence in there somewhere. And so that construct of layers of process must take into consideration all of these issues for each country, and they're different in each country. In Australia and New Zealand, we have written accepted legislation by each state from 1978, which is accepted by religious leaders. Unfortunately, we have laws in 7 states. They're not all unanimous on every issue, but they do define death as irreversible cessation of all function of the brain or person and irreversible cessation of circulation of blood. So those are the 2 specifics. Interestingly, of course, we now have a problem with that first definition, irreversible cessation of circulation of blood, as normothermic in situ perfusion of organs for retrieval actually restarts artificially circulation of blood. And therefore there must be, in that circumstance, perhaps a requirement for the second definition of death. That's why there are 2 definitions of death. So in summary, as we come back to the overall view of the schema of living and deceased organ donation and transplant, I put in green those areas that are specific to medical protocols, and we'll discuss those in another talk. But in grey are those which require at least regulation, if not legislation, to provide a cohesive, ethical transplant program for every nation. Look forward to discussing these with you. Thank you for the opportunity to talk.